Stop the world!
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm Olivia Nelson.
And I'm David Rowe.
Today's guest, Florence Gaub, has one of the most fascinating jobs in national security. She's a futurist for NATO. That doesn't mean predicting the future, but rather studying possible futures to help prepare decision makers and strategic planners for the unexpected.
It's a pretty cool job, Liv.
I want to be her.
So do I. Florence is the director of the research division at the NATO Defense College in Rome. She should actually ask if they could set up a campus in Florence. I didn't ask her that. She leads a team that thinks about what-if events that could throw NATO's strategic plans into disarray. In today's conversation, Florence explains how she and her team make forecasts, how they project forward, given the enormous complexity of geopolitics and international affairs, the value of being prepared, interestingly, to reduce reaction time. There's a big problem with being caught flat-footed when things don't go the way you expect, and how to communicate your ideas to decision makers. So, of course, you're not just filling their heads with pessimistic information, but actually giving them something that they can act on.
All very important stuff. Florence reflects on some of her previous work, such as her report for the European Union on global trends to 2030, some of the forecasts that have proven particularly useful, as well as the value of science fiction in forecasting. You also discuss the role of powerful individuals in history, major trends shaping the world today from climate change to technology, and the role of AI in forecasting, which I'm sure, Dave, was your favourite part of the conversation.
It was like dessert. I left it to the end. And on science fiction, let me just say it is a common thing for NatSec people to be science fiction nerds as well. And I, in fact, wasn't into science fiction until I got into national security. They weirdly went together. So very useful takeaways from Florence's conversation, not least the need to put yourself in other people's shoes to understand how they might respond differently from the way you expect. We had an interesting exchange about that, the value of diverse cultures, personalities and perspectives in a forecasting team. Of course, we've seen what can go wrong just in recent decades when strategic planners assume that other parts of the world and other leaders are motivated by the same values and preferences that they are.
Indeed. This work has never been more important, so please enjoy Florence Gaub.
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm here with Florence Gaub in person here in the studio.
Great to be here.
Welcome. So, Florence, you have the coolest job I've ever heard of. You're a futurist, a security futurist for NATO. We'll get this clear at the outset. You don't try to predict the future, right?
No.
But you sort of study possible futures in order to better prepare us.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's start with how you do that. I mean, I have ideas in my head about how you might do it. But
I
just
don't have a
explain
crystal ball.
what are the processes. Okay, all right.
Some people ask that. Actually, I have one. It was a gift to a friend of mine, but it doesn't work.
Right.
So the way we do that, so what futurists do is they just like academics in general, actually, we look at all the information that's out there on, what do we have certainty over. Some things we have high certainty over, like we have a lot of data like climate change, demographics, stuff like that. And then where we don't have data, we try to fill in with plausible scenarios, ideas where this could go. We study causalities, what leads to what. And then we develop, mostly we like scenarios because scenarios are events-based developments. I think that I find them more useful than trend analysis. Trend analysis is very popular as well, but we really do a lot of scenarios. And then, because with the scenarios, we go back into the present and say, okay, what do we do with that now? How can we act in the present to influence or avoid that future?
Sorry, and for non, I suppose I'm not an academic person or a technical person, but scenarios, I mean, you're talking about actual like desktop exercises or tabletop exercises or something like that?
Obviously working for NATO, we're a worst case organization, I always say, right? Because we're in the business of war. So our job is to think about the most existential types of futures. So let me give you one what-if scenario that's coming out. Once a year, we have a collection of what-if scenarios coming out.
Okay.
So we have one that's about a nuclear weapon being detonated in space.
Right.
There's historical precedent, happened in the 60s. What effects would that have on Earth?
Yeah.
Mainly a problem with electricity, power cuts and all that. So we're imagining what if Russia did that?
Okay.
With what effect, what intention, how can we avoid that and all that? So that would be a scenario along those lines. Normally, ours are 5 years into the future. So we don't deal with 2050 or 2040 even. Why? Because our decision makers, obviously, they want to influence something that's within their reach. So we're looking maximum 5 years into the future.
But you're essentially asking what if questions and then
Yes.
proceeding from there, but plausible what if questions. Right?
Exactly. So normally our what ifs based on what we call a weak signal. A weak signal is an early sign that something could happen.
Yep.
It's not yet a trend. If you want, it's like a trend being just born. And based on that weak signal, we develop that further and imagine, okay, what if this actually becomes a solid trend, a solid indication that something is happening? So we have some evidence. We don't imagine aliens coming to Earth or whatever.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it has to be rooted in reality.
Right. Okay. I mean, so even 5 years is a long time in international politics, of course. I mean, we were talking just before we started filming about, segmenting recent history into 5-10 year periods, whatever it is. Let's say you took someone at the turn of the millennium and said, 5 years from now, what do you think things are going to look like? They wouldn't have said that, Islamists would, or jihadists would fly 2 buildings into Twin Towers, and the US would invade 2 countries. Well, I mean, both of them unsuccessfully, arguably, if you project forward far enough. It's very, very difficult because international relations, geopolitics are extremely complicated systems with all these inputs. Talk a bit about the utility, the value of what it is that you do. I mean, are you trying to give leaders better decision-making abilities, improve their decision-making? Are you looking for actionable options for responses?
100%. If you don't, like in strategic foresight in general, if you don't lead to any action in the present, then you've kind of missed your job. So that's why I'm always saying that it's a scenario that scares people into paralysis, which is a common reaction. It's called the Cassandra effect. Then you have actually missed your target. Now, I think you say something super important about geopolitics, and I think that's something that for some people will sound heretical. Specifically, I'm going to say that international relations theory, everything that we study in university, the realists and constructivists and all that, they're all attempts at making predictions about where international relations will go in the future, what are patterns for interaction between states.
Yep.
And I'm saying none of these actually have universal predictive power.
Yep.
I mean, they're still useful because anything that helps you structure your thinking about a problem is useful. But I'm saying the only way you can actually the only tool available that helps you navigate exactly what you said is the complexity of international relations. I think it's strategic foresight, because strategic foresight is the only tool you have that includes all these idiosyncrasies, right? What makes the geopolitical system so complex is we don't have a lot of data. Like, I can't call Putin and say, can I interview you for my qualitative analysis that traces patterns for invasion decisions or whatever. Even the people that he spoke to was a small circle of people. So you have a lot of data. Decision-making takes place in a small circle. It's defense, so the data is by definition secretive. And then you have notions of rationality, values, interests that are not necessarily easy to understand from the outside. The only thing you have is empathy and imagination to put yourself in the other people's shoes. And that's what we use in strategic foresight. So I think it's actually much more useful than studying international relations in terms of trying to understand what can come your way.
Right. Okay. That's fascinating. Spicy. I love it. I mean, your point is well taken, though, because I mean, the international theories that I suppose the theories of international relations that we all hear about. I mean, they're essentially kind of models, and they have their usefulness up to a point. Of course, I mean, it's you believe that the world operates in a particular way, and therefore, if you apply that model to a particular point in time or a scenario, then you can assume that actors are going to to act in a particular way according to that model.
Well,
but of course, it turns out they don't.
No,
Yes.
Fukuyama, right? Fukuyama proposed, I think this is what the future is going to look like.
Yep.
A lot of people in Europe actually believed that. And turns out Putin didn't. So I think they have their value. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying, they shouldn't exist, but they shouldn't replace creative, constructive, imaginative thinking about the future.
Right. Yep. I like the idea of a fuzzy image. I mean, you're drawing fuzzy images of the future.
Yeah.
They're not precise, but even a fuzzy image is useful.
So I compare strategic foresight or all things future to the gym for the mind.
Okay.
It exercises your critical thinking, your imagination. What happens as a result is that you are, even if a scenario doesn't correspond 100% to the one that you thought about, it reduces surprise.
Yep.
And what does that do? It decreases your response time, so you'll be less shocked.
Yep.
You will also have a clearer notion of what your capabilities are, because you will have thought through the possible consequences and your own tools that you have available to deal with the future. So you also need to be self-aware, right? So in a way, what we call that is creating a memory of the future. So you read a scenario, and then something similar happens, and your mind already knows, wait, I've seen that before.
Yeah.
It reminds me of XYZ.
Yeah.
I know what to do
Yeah.
next. And that's what we're trying to accomplish.
That is fascinating, and that seems to. I mean, even if it were that alone, that would have value, right? Because whenever, I mean, the human reaction when we're confronted with something highly unexpected is almost always freeze, flat-footed,
Exactly.
a lapse. I mean, it's. I mean, I'm picking on poor George W. Bush suddenly here, but I mean, it's hard to forget that image or that the video of him
Mission
when he was
accomplished.
first told about when he was
September
first told
11.
about September 11, he was
The
reading
shock.
reading a book to the kids, remember,
Yeah.
and he got that look of absolute shock on his face, and then he spent another 2 minutes or so finishing the book. Now, I mean,
100%. And there's other examples from history, right? There's Stalin, when Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union despite having a non-aggression agreement. I think he disappeared for 10 days or 2 weeks.
Right.
He was so shocked. And you can argue, some people say that Russia until today is traumatized by that attack. So reducing response time is of huge value in international relations. But, what you just said was that's the minimum. We can achieve even more.
Yep.
But I think that you achieve regardless of how accurate the scenario is. I'll give you another example. In 2021, so just before the invasion of Ukraine, I was at the EU Institute for Security Studies at the time. I was also pushing for what-if scenarios. The way I always do that is the analysts have freedom to choose their scenario. They just have to provide evidence for a weak signal.
Right.
And of the 10 contributions, 3 or even 4 talked about Russia.
Right.
None of them talked about Russia in Ukraine. But you had Russia in the Balkans, Russia in Moldova, Russia in the Baltic state. So it was like, putting your hands on the train track and feeling, okay, something's coming.
Yeah.
We're not sure where and in what shape, but we can feel a belligerence coming. And I think that was also one of the values.
Okay. Hands on the train track. That's another
Exactly.
good analogy for it. What about being believed and being taken seriously? I mean, you're asking potentially decision makers with very, very limited bandwidth, limited resources, limited, there are only so many things that they can respond to. You're asking them to invest time and effort potentially in contingencies that never eventuate or go against their existing expectations and beliefs. It feels like you're working against a whole lot of instinctive human biases here. Is that difficult?
Yes, it is difficult, but there is a way around that. So I think what people like myself have to learn is to think with their client in mind, meaning think what the decision maker will need or also their psychology, right? And of course, that differs. And the longer you know somebody and if you have a relationship of trust, that will help. Because, it's not just about the message, it's also about the messenger. And that's very interesting. So some people will respond, will have a completely allergic reaction to overdoing emotions. Other people will need emotions to engage with the scenario. So I think you have to think a lot more about the person you're advising than about your message. And I think that requires, frankly, checking your ego, because I think what a lot of us are guilty of is wanting to be right and wanting to, have influence. And you remember when the pandemic started and Twitter was, inundated with people saying, I saw it coming, but nobody heard me. Well, maybe then you failed at your job because a successful foresighter shouldn't be judged on whether they were right, but whether they were heard. Yep. So my most successful scenarios never came about because somebody did something about them. But then you can't prove that you were right because it never happened, right? So that's why, you have to learn humility in this job.
Can you give any examples of that? That's really, Can you give an example of a
So
something you anticipated that didn't eventuate, but which you have some reason to believe?
one thing we mobilize, because that's the other thing, I think, speaking of ego, you are much more successful if you create alliances with other people. So when several academics, think tankers, advisors coalesce around one opinion and pass that on to decision makers, you're much more successful than if it's just you and one person. I mean, that's a bit of a fantasy for a lot of people that want to advise policymakers, but in reality, it's normally what I call a school of fish. One example, I think, was during the height of tensions in Iraq, but also Syria. You will remember in the early mid-2000s when ideas came up to partition Iraq, and then also during the Syrian civil war to partition along ethnic lines.
Yep.
And we were all saying the problem is not ethnicity, it's everything that came around it. And of course, Islamic State used that, and all the jihadists they used that, but we said that's not what the issue is about. And I'm happy to say that partition never happened. It doesn't mean that all the problems went away, but we were sure that creating statelets wouldn't solve the problem. Right. So it's not one of the big ticket items. Yep. The other one was after the Arab Spring, we were all warning very much about youth unemployment. We said policy priority has to be to keep youth unemployment at 30% or lower, but definitely make sure it doesn't increase. So it's not a great success because there was no real dent in youth unemployment in the Middle East, North Africa, but it was kept at that level. So, that's nothing to write home about. Nobody's going to say, yay, we avoided. Well, we don't even actually know exactly what we avoided because it didn't happen. Yep. But I think over time you build a reputation for being a trusted advisor, and that's what it's about. Not being super dramatic and being in the news saying, I saw it coming, nobody heard me. That's the fastest way of not being heard. Right.
Instead, just giving steady, sober, useful advice.
Exactly.
And something like youth unemployment, absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Talk about the obstacles that you encounter. I mean, like I said before, you're working against all these biases. Confirmation bias is a famous one. Groupthink is another famous one. I'm gonna just state my own position here, and you can give me your thoughts on it. But I mean, failure of imagination seems to be one of the biggest ones at the moment for me, including, I guess most troublingly, failure of imagination about how vulnerable democracy might be. The assumption that institutions are enduring and are so strong that that they will naturally sort of self-preserve through the ups and downs of difficulty in democracies, when institutions are in fact just still made up of people who are prone to the influence of the people around them and might be prone to the same false expectation that the institution will just endure by its own nature without anyone proactively and actively kind of propping it up and reinforcing it. To me, failure of imagination seems to be a really, really big one at the moment. But talk a little bit about the sort of obstacles that you most often encounter.
So it depends on the organization that you're working in. I think what I like about working in NATO is that NATO is a political military alliance, so there are civilians and military people. Military people tend to be very happy to entertain all kinds of catastrophic scenarios because at the end of the day, that's their job. So they are not that scared of imagination. I mean, they're scared of maybe using their own imagination, but they're very happy to use our what-if scenarios. And they're not as likely, I find, to reject a scenario because it doesn't confirm their worldview. If it's plausibly explained, they're happy to think it through. That's been my experience. However, although I'm a civilian myself, or perhaps because I'm a civilian myself, I'm going to criticize the civilians. And that's both in NATO, but also in the EU, where I worked for a long time, and maybe, in other European government sections. My experience is that the more normative you are, and I will say the EU is a very normative organization. What do I mean by normative? The more you have strong beliefs about what the world is and how it should be, the harder it is for you to imagine something that's outside of that realm. And so that's why I think, NATO was probably faster in accepting what was going on in the run-up to the Ukraine war than many EU representatives, because the EU fundamentally is what was the EU at the outset? It was an economic organization. I always say it's a development organization. It believes that trade and economics are actually what holds peace together. It's a very laudable goal. Peace through prosperity and all that. But it also makes it's such a, I'm not going to say wishful thinking, but it's such a positive view of the world that anything that goes counter that you said confirmation bias, will be a lot more difficult for them to accept. So, and I think it's not just the EU. I think civilians generally have a tendency for that. You too?
If something's a moral outrage or irrational, I find it very, very hard to believe that it's going to happen.
Yes, I understand that, but it means that you have a blind spot. And so what's interesting, we have trouble engaging decision makers, but we have our own biases too. And that's, I think, the most important characteristic for futurists is to know that you have biases and what they are, and learn how to deal with them. And so my trick is always, whenever you have a very strong emotional reaction, then you should be aware, like, bing, okay, hang on, I think there might be a bias here. You might be very attached to this outcome for some reason. And then what I do then is to define under what conditions I would change my mind. So I feel that something is happening, and then I'm like, oh, that would never happen. Okay, under what circumstances will I change my mind? And then you can decide for yourself. It's like giving yourself a watermark and saying, okay, when that is reached, then I will have to change my mind, and I define it myself. So the way I find that the way you can't get really people out of their bias, but you can understand where they're coming from. And I think what helps is invite them to self-reflect. Like I said, you can say to them, under what conditions do you think you would change your mind? Or why is it so important for you to believe that, right? So engage them in a conversation. You shouldn't just tell people you're just stupid to believe that, because that's their worldview. And they build that worldview over years, with information stacking and all that. But you should be aware, you get into a field where long-held beliefs, your own and your counterparts can get in the way, won't necessarily be in the way, but can get in the way of seeing the situation for what it is.
Right, okay. And an extension of that, I think you mentioned empathy earlier, an extension of that is understanding that the way you see the current situation might not be the way that everybody else sees it, that someone with a set of different values and preferences or whatever it might be, including a potential adversary, might see things very, very 100%. Differently and is not going to act the way you expect.
And that's why it's so important that you engage with people from other countries and cultures. And, okay, I can't go to Russia, but I can travel to other countries and talk to people and just, without any emotion, just ask, okay, how do you see that? For instance, I was in Morocco shortly after the war started, and I asked a friend of mine there, what do you think about the war in Ukraine? She said, well, I don't see how it's so different from Iraq. And of course, then I came back to Europe and I told some of my colleagues there, and they were outraged. She said, it's not at all the same as Iraq. And I said, put that aside. Just accept for a moment that somebody in North Africa will think it looks a lot like Iraq. Just leave it for what it is. And I think very often we are our own worst enemies because we don't want to see it. We get emotional about it rather than saying, okay, this is an inconvenient view for me, but it is a view that's out there.
I completely agree with that. And certainly traveling and spending time in different places. I mean, the Middle East is a great example, isn't it? I mean, you've really got to spend that time there to understand, that thinking can be extremely different from what you are accustomed to.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, let's just stay on the diversity thing for a moment. I mean, presumably building a team that is diverse is, whether it's cultural, whether it's religious, gender, or just diversity of personalities for that matter as well.
Paramount.
Right.
You can't. It's a team sport, and the more diverse your team is, the better.
Yep.
And when I say diversity, so I mean working for NATO means I'm lucky because by definition everybody's from a different country. You have a lot of different professional backgrounds. You have military, you have civilian, you have the different services, and you have different personalities. And my team, we once did a personality self-test, and it was very interesting because we discovered that I think there were 10 different personality types, and we had 10 different people. We had one from each. And I thought, okay, that's challenging. But then one of my colleagues said, no, it's great. You have one for every situation. So that is the perfect setup to do strategic foresight, because we all look at the problem in a different way. or we see different things, or, when I mentioned weak signals, they will all notice different things. Right. Because also the way they inform themselves, what they read, what they listen to, it's different. And then when we come together, then that's really beautiful. So, beautiful. It's just mega productive. And I understand that, sometimes people come to NATO and they're so frustrated because multinational institutions, that doesn't look very efficient at the outside, because you have all these different cultures and you have misunderstandings and whatever. But I think ultimately the outcome speaks for itself.
Right. Let's talk about the world now. Let's put into practice some of what you're talking about here. You wrote this report, Global Trends, for the EU back in 2019. I looked through it; it holds up very well.
Thank you. I looked at it the other day.
Yeah, there's no Francis Fukuyama type situations there. I think Francis is brilliant, by the way.
He is. Yeah. It's just I think
he's been held. Everyone remembers him for one line.
I'm sorry for him because it's a different conversation. But I think he's great. But he's not a prophet.
No.
And no political scientist.
And you didn't try to be in global trends. Instead, you said here are some important issues that we should keep an eye on. And you were right. AI, obviously, tick, populism, risks to democracy. Demographics, all these sorts of things. So. With your crystal ball that doesn't work, what do you see in 2025 at the moment? What are the sort of key drivers that you're looking at in 2025?
So it's funny. I looked at that report the other day myself, and it's always a bit painful. Well, no, it's not painful. But originally you think, "Ooh, should I look at that? Maybe I was wrong." Right. But you definitely should read your old foresight, and because this is how you learn. And I looked at it and I thought, boring. All of this happened, and I realized, that means it was a good report. Because if you read an old report and you go, that's funny, that's wrong, then you were wrong. So luckily, we managed to get. Almost everything. Well, there was nothing wrong. Some of the timelines, because it was written before the pandemic, when it comes to digitalization happened faster because of the pandemic than we thought. So if you're asking me today, I think the number one trend, of course, that continues to exist is climate change. Since the report came out, of course, a lot has happened. A lot of commitments have happened. A lot of change has actually started to unroll. Is it fast enough? We're still not on track for 2%, but if all the commitments are being met, then I think we have a good chance of getting there. But climate change is still an issue. You know what's interesting? The report before had talked about climate change, but not as prominently as the one that I wrote. And when I wrote that, it was not entirely uncontroversial, because many people didn't think it was such a big issue back in 2018. Can you imagine? Because today it's like, that's the norm.
Yeah. So, and sorry, I'm going to let you finish your answer, but I just want to inject something quickly, which is that I think that far from being boring, a lot of the things that you mentioned are actually accelerating now. AI is, you were talking about it 6 years ago, great, but it's actually a far more. It's spinning at such an enormous rate now. Populism has got worse, I would say, and it's getting to the point of where it potentially is crisis level. I think demographics are. You look at South Korea, for instance, or Western Europe, or anyway.
So I even wrote that a war, purely statistically, a war in the next decade was likely. Of course, I didn't say it's going to be in Ukraine, but so. Climate change, 100%. What's interesting that the demographic change is already unfolding. So I guess if I had to look out for the next, if I had to say 2035, by 2035 we will have probably, I would guess, found a way to deal with it. But the demographic, so the 2%, losing 2% of the workforce also means that we have at the same time 2% more spending for healthcare. So I would say that both the economy and the healthcare sector, so innovation and medicine, are moving in that direction. So it's too soon to say what exactly, we have no breakthrough yet on cancer and stuff, but we have beginning to have positive signs on Alzheimer's. So I think this whole notion of longevity, which was not, we didn't talk about that 5 to 6 years ago. So I think that's emerging because of the demographic change. In terms of AI and technological evolutions that we're seeing, so I think you'll see that the big AI earthquake that we're living through right now, in the next decade, we will have a clear idea of what it can actually do, which jobs will it actually replace. We will remember in the report we started looking at the numbers, and it was so big. Nobody had really an idea of how it's going to impact the labor market. So I think from here, we're now moving in that direction. So we know it's going to change the labor market. We have a better idea now than we had 6 years ago, but it's still not clear, right? And we see that with, generative AI. It's great at some things, and we're also discovering it's not so great at other things. So it's not, the holy grail account to everything. Space was not in the report at the time, or very, very barely, I think. So the space is making the big return. Yeah, we're having the 2035 mission to Mars is planned, manned mission to Mars, or human mission to Mars.
Gotcha.
So that, I think, is a trend. And then geopolitically, what's interesting is that also demographically, China's population is shrinking. Russia's population is shrinking. So, of course, as Westerners, we always we're obsessed with ourselves and we're shrinking, but we're not the only ones. So one of the questions we're having, so I don't have the answer to that, but it's a trend, is that what is the impact of that on geopolitics? As in, can you actually conduct a war like in Ukraine if you just lost 14 million people? Because by 2035, Russia will lose 14 million in population size, because
40.
14.
Right.
Still a lot.
No,
because
sure.
if you're having a manpower intense warfare as Russia does, that's going to be difficult. So same for China. Some people argue China cannot afford a war because all the families have only one child. So how do you sell that domestically? So I have more questions than answers. I would have to go deeper, but I will say the technological debate has moved, I think, very much in the direction also of intersection of climate change and technology. Of course, geoengineering. People are looking at that now, I think, more seriously. Of course, the big question is CO2 capture. Will that be a breakthrough? We don't have reasons to believe that right now, but if it did, that would change the game, definitely.
Right, okay.
I could go on and on and on, but these are just a few.
Thanks. And I could too. I'm going to skip a few. I wrote down so many questions because I was so excited about the topic, but I'm going to skip a few because I'm conscious of the time. I want to get to science fiction. So you've contributed to, you've been, you've used science fiction in some of your work. I completely get the relevance of it because in writers' terms, it's often referred to as speculative fiction rather than science fiction. And really, we're really talking about speculation about the future. Alternative. It starts with the what if question, basically.
Yeah.
Look at these great. Good example is Jurassic Park. The guy says, okay, what if someone cloned dinosaurs and stuck them on an equatorial island? And,
or the Matrix. What if we live in a simulation?
Absolutely. Yeah. Tell me about the value of
science fiction
to people in your craft.
So I think there's, you mentioned imagination. Obviously, you can push imagination. So our what if scenarios aren't science fiction because they're science-based, like there's evidence that something is happening, etc. If you want to push this a lot further, you have to go full-on imagination, and that's science fiction. And I think then we should be candid and say, we have no evidence, but we also have no reason to exclude that this could happen at some point in the future. So typically, the way we used it at the NATO Defense College, we had a project last year, NATO 2099. It was for NATO's 75th anniversary. And my idea was, well, how about we travel 75 years into the future? Think about what NATO can or will look like then. Now, no strategic foresighter can go 75 years into the future. There's just way too little evidence, especially in our field, right? Defense, geopolitics. So I thought, well, let's ask science fiction authors and specifically do what in French you call le collectif imaginaire. So when you have many, many people together imagining something, you find common patterns. So we had 40 contributions, 40, and we stacked them and found what are the common patterns that they're finding about the future of NATO. They had 3 questions. What does NATO look like in 2099? What challenges has it overcome? And what challenges is it facing? And then from that, we devised it, we turned it into a graphic novel, because a graphic novel is much more attractive than just word on text, on paper. And it was a huge success because it went counter to some of the prevalent feelings about NATO in the summer of 24. This feeling that NATO is over and Russia is stronger and the West is over and all that. We didn't find that in the contributions. It was actually a lot of, it doesn't, if you look at the novel, it doesn't say everything's going to be fine. It says there are challenges and is candid about them. But what the utility of that is, I think it captured an imagination that there was no space for elsewhere. Now, what's interesting is there's a French researcher, Marie Roussy. She just finished a study on the use of science fiction for military institutions. And she finds that when a military organization tasks science fiction authors, inevitably they end up producing science fiction that has a huge confirmation bias, that caters to what the organization wants to hear. Okay. So I can't tell you, are we part of that or are we not part of that? I would like to think not. But the utility in general for military institutions is, of course, to take people out of their day-to-day thinking, because that helps also with overcoming bias. Taiwan, right? A lot of people have think about Taiwan. It's debated everywhere. So a lot of people have an opinion already. How feasible is it? What would it look like? What would be the reactions be? So for us, that's not so interesting to have a conversation about, because everybody already has an opinion. Let's take them into a field they haven't thought about. And science fiction is great for that.
Right, okay. And it's fascinating that a lot of I know lots of military people who are huge science fiction fans. And the best science fiction actually often does have some pretty clever, not just... it's got some whiz-bang ideas and technology and these sorts of things. But, the best is actually strategically very interesting as well. They craft some really interesting strategic scenarios.
And even innovators take cues from science fiction movies. Like, what could we... have you seen Star Trek lately? A lot of the Star Trek today, you're like, yeah, that's an iPad, that's a computer, that's a sliding door. That was in the 60s. Right. None of that existed. Yep. But they gave people ideas on what could be interesting.
It definitely seems to, or the internet or virtual reality is an obvious one. Virtual reality was
was Matrix established virtual reality, the headset.
Yep. All right, let's bang through a few so we can, because I don't want to keep you too much longer. But individuals, to what extent do powerful individuals drive historic events?
The eternal question. So, that in political science, like at university, we don't study individuals because we think everything is, human beings act as a collective, et cetera, et cetera. But when I will remember, I think it was the High Representative of the EU that said, I think, was it the pandemic or was it the invasion? I can't remember. But he said, foresight is always about trends, but in reality, it's events that drive things. Now, it's always a combination of both. An event is a combination of a trend in the same way that an individual will never operate completely in a vacuum. So we're assuming, for instance, I was asked this the other day, actually here in Australia, do you think that when Putin leaves, a new time will come for relations between Russia and Western Europe? And I said, as much as I would like to believe that everything that's going on is just Putin, I also think that there is a wider context that led to him coming about. So I think the precise decisions, especially in an authoritarian system, I think, yes, the individual plays a huge role. And we as democracies should spend more time thinking about Xi Jinping, about Vladimir Putin as outsizing what we look at, I don't know, a Prime Minister in Australia, Chancellor in Germany, because their influence is much bigger. Yep. Their constraints are different than ours. So I will say it's a combination. You probably would have to look a lot more at the context. So what political system is it? Yep. What kind of person is it, et cetera, to understand what's more important here, the person or the context. I think in a European country, the context is more important than the person. But the person will still be important. So I would say I'm coming down on a balance somewhere between. I'm not saying the individual is not important. I think it's hugely important, but I also think they're driven by a context. But in an authoritarian system, the individual will have an outsized influence.
Let's touch on Donald Trump then, because he to me he is the obvious example of where an individual is having enormous significant influence. Now, people will talk about how there were these underlying, political frustrations in the US that had been building up for a number of years. That you can look at, stagnating middle class wages, or offshoring and globalization. There are or immigration as being an issue. There are obviously a bunch of forces that are independent of Trump that were building up. But even taking account of those, it just seems to me that he has had an enormous individual impact in in harnessing them and some would argue exploiting them. But the fact that we spend a lot of time when we're analysing US policy, we spend a lot of time asking ourselves what is Trump's instinctive emotional reaction to X, Y, Z. I mean, I do media from time to time, and I did a TV interview. This is, I think it was around the time of the Iran-Israel war, and I thought I coined a phrase at the time, which was psychopolitical analysis, because I felt like for Trump, this was actually this is something we all have to engage in now, is this psychopolitical analysis, which is in understanding the politics, we actually really need to understand the psychology of one man. I mean, do you feel like
in a way that's what I just said about Xi Jinping and Putin, right? So in a way that without knowing your word, I think that's exactly what I'm suggesting. And you need to think about who is this person. I will say that in presidential systems, so the US, but also France, for instance, you will have to spend more time on thinking about that individual because they have a lot more power than in a parliamentary system, for instance, right? I think what's interesting about Trump is that, yes, like any US president, he has a lot of power. I mean, as a president per se, but American president, obviously. But when I look at the surveys, the opinion polls, what he's been doing, there seems to be still a very solid majority, not a majority, I think it's like 49% approval rate, but then depends on the topics. He has very big approval rate on certain things, not doing so well on inflation, on the economy and stuff. So I still see, by the way, same in Russia. You have a lot of opinion polls that seem to indicate that the Russian population broadly agrees with Putin. They don't like people dying, but they think that the special operation, the war in Ukraine, was a good idea. So I think you're right. We got out of that habit, I think, with the end of the Cold War. I think I was looking at, what profiles have there been done about political leaders. The last one I could find was Saddam Hussein in the 80s during the Iran-Iraq war. Like, what is Saddam Hussein like, and how would he respond to this and that? Really? And I think we got out of doing that because I think in the 90s there was this perception that, Fukuyama, we're all kind of the same, we all want the same things, a good life, democracy and all that. Yeah. So it would feel kind of weird to draw up a psychological profile. I think it felt old school, but I agree with you. We need to find a way back to that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, because that's definitely proven not. I mean, globalization was still some merits to it, and it's been a fascinating period in world history. But the limitation or the limits of it have been demonstrated, sort of spectacularly, haven't they? And including the fact that. Yeah, we're not all the same. We don't all want the same things. Yeah. Not because we're all the same human beings. We're all, we've all got the same brain, the same bodies, all this kind of thing. But there's 8 billion of us spread.
Because I think we also, maybe this is controversial for me to say, but just imagining or talking about another culture was beginning to be seen as othering.
Yep.
And just, I'm not them, so I'm different, and that's negatively connotated. But, I've worked in the Middle East for a long time, and I said, no, thinking, and in fact, it's the opposite. It's actually honoring their culture by thinking about what are you thinking about? What am I thinking about? So difference doesn't mean hierarchy. It doesn't mean I'm better than you just because I realize that you're not like me. And I think, I think we need to get back to that.
No, I think that shouldn't be controversial. It's a very legitimate point. Okay, 2 other things. Technology. Part of your job, obviously, is data. I mean, you look at what you can actually draw from statistics, from numbers, to get a sense of which way things are going. How is that changing already, and how do you anticipate it will change with the technology that's available now, particularly AI analysis of large amounts of data? Is that going to? So, will that give us a crystal ball?
Well, we're playing with it. What we find is, so far, what we've seen, AI isn't. AI lacks imagination, unfortunately. Because it's very good at just getting a lot of material in and then finding the most probable patterns. And everything that we're working on, war or geopolitics generally, is a field that's not made up of high probabilities. Right. So it cannot really tell us good stories. What it's good at is getting large data sets together and then help us analyze them. But the qualitative analysis, we do that. Okay. So it's more like a junior assistant in a way at the moment. And but that's super helpful. So I have one data person on my team. She, for instance, could show, thanks to data, that the people being sent to Ukraine were drafted from regions in Russia that had not voted for United Russia, which is the party that supports Putin. So that is useful because that gives us an indication for what the cohesion is like in those units, etc. So we should definitely use all the data available, but I will say the qualitative analysis that humans do better than the machine for now.
Right. Okay. So it's still your analytical expertise
Yeah.
with your human judgment. Those two things fused, but on top of more presentable data. That's the advantage at the moment.
Exactly. I'll give you a stupid example, but I was writing a scenario in 2032. I think it's the Olympics in Brisbane.
Yes.
And
correct.
and then I said, help me
If
write
they
a
happen.
scenario. Yeah, if they're happening, help me write a scenario. And then it said, oh yeah, it's in August, so it's going to be super hot. And I said, but Cherry, August in Australia, it's winter. It's like, oh yeah, you're right. Right. So that's a pretty basic thing to get wrong.
Yep.
But it just shows you, I'm not saying, AI isn't a threat. I'm just saying that probably we'll still have a bit of a way to go before it can do a lot of the thinking for us.
Sure. That's an interesting mess. That's these things they get wrong. Okay. Final question. A lot of people might be listening to this thinking, this is such common sense. Presumably governments everywhere do it. Presumably all organisations like alliances do it. But if I understand correctly, there's actually a deficit of this kind of work. Now, a couple of examples that I would point to. The Pentagon shut its Office of Net Assessment this year. It doesn't seem to have replaced it with anything comparable, so it looks like that's done. ASPI, I'm going to give a shout out to one of my colleagues here, Chris Taylor. He did some work last year on strategic warning intelligence, saying it's something that the Australian government needed to incorporate into its intel community. Now, we had an independent intelligence review that came out subsequent to that and had a sort of mild version of what Chris was recommending. Chris's piece, where he wrote about this, it's got an award-winning opening line. Even mind-boggling actions typically have a logic that's discoverable, he said, and he went on to cite Hitler declaring war on America after Pearl Harbor or Putin invading Ukraine. Is there a big deficit of this sort of work, and why do you think that is, and is that changing in any positive way?
So when you look at the history of strategic foresight, it always ebbs and flows. In most states, it will have a heyday and then disappear and then come back. Every time a government or a society comes to a point of uncertainty, they bring back strategic foresight. So we have, I know a PhD student currently working on strategic foresight in the EU who showed me, in the 70s, 70s was a pretty tough decade, lots of inflation, uncertainty, and yada. So the European Commission at the time, created a strategic foresight unit, dismantled it in the 80s when things had calmed down. Then the Cold War ended. They brought it back, ended it, and got rid of it in the early 2000s because, got used to the future. Yep. The future is always uncertain, but you can get used to a certain future, you imagine. So I think that's kind of the norm. It comes and goes. What I would say is that in Europe, in NATO, we have the classical states that are better at it. Not great, but better. So you have the US, UK, Portugal, Spain, Netherlands, and France.
Right.
And then you're going to say, what about Germany? And Germany is a huge economic power. Germany, I think, is honestly not that great. I mean, you have it here and there, but you don't have a national culture thinking about the future, which I think is a huge problem. Sorry, I forgot the foresight champion of all times because they have not gone through the up and downs. That's Finland.
Right.
And Finland has had an established structure since the 80s. So it started with an ecosystem of think tankers, then the Cold War ended. And since then, it has an established structured process in parliament. They have a committee on the future. They have future experts in each ministry that liaise with each other. They have a report. I can't remember how many every 2 or 3 years or so. And what's interesting is Finland is also the most prepared country when it comes to Russia. And funnily enough, they're also one of the happiest people on earth.
Right. Okay.
So I'm thinking there is a link. And I saw a study the other day that said the more you think about the future in a structured way, not just obsessing, but thinking about what can I do, the happier, the more optimistic you become. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think we should all be a bit more like Finland. And I would hope, you mentioned the US. I think it's a Wayside example. The Office of Net Assessment had been in place since the 60s or 70s. And in any case, 60s, right? Andrew Marshall, a really long time. And then they got rid of something that we also thought was extremely good. So it ebbs and flows, but I would say keep it because it will always be useful.
Yep. Okay. Finland. There you
Finland.
go. Despite being dark,
We should all be more
very,
Finnish.
very cold.
Yeah, right.
And
And
much
then
of the year.
you go to Finland, you tell them, "Did you know you're the happiest people on earth?" Like, yeah, nobody's more surprised than we are.
Brilliant. Okay. Florence, thank you so much.
Thank you so
for
much for
joining me.
having
It's
me.
been a great chat. Very nice talking to you.
Thank you.
That's all we have time for this week on Stop the World. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon.